The Holloway Heirloom. Chapter 1. The carriage crested the hill, and Jane Holloway saw her childhood home for the first time in 12 years. Holloway Manor sat in the valley below, its grey stone walls softened by the spring mist that rose from the river. It was smaller than she remembered, and older and sadder. A house that had been waiting for someone to come home, and had long since given up hope. She had not been waiting. She had built a life in London, a quiet life of chaperoning nieces and managing her brother's household, a life in which the memory of Holloway Manor had faded to a pleasant dream of childhood summers and the sharp, painful reality of the winter her father died. She had not thought she would ever return. But then her brother had written to say the estate was sold, that the new owner had taken possession, that if she wished to see the old place one last time, she must come at Easter, before the last of the Holloway things were packed away. And so she had come, though she had told no one the true reason: the treasure. It was a family legend, passed down through generations of Holloways like a sacred trust. When the young pretender had marched through England in 1745, a group of Sussex families had pledged their loyalty to the Stuart cause, collecting gold and jewels to fund the rebellion. The rebellion had failed, the cause was lost, and the treasure, if it had ever existed, had been hidden somewhere on Holloway land, waiting for the rightful king to return. Jane's father had believed in the treasure with a fervour that bordered on obsession. He had spent his final years searching for it, following clues in old prayer books and crumbling maps, growing more and more distant from the world of the living until the search consumed him entirely. And now a stranger owned the manor, a man who had appeared from nowhere with a claim to the estate that no one in the family had been able to dispute. A man who, Jane was certain, had come for the same reason her father had spent his life chasing. The carriage drew up before the manor's worn steps, and Jane stepped out into the cold spring air. The door opened before she could knock, and she found herself face to face with the new master of Holloway Manor. He was not what she had expected. Captain Thomas Gray, for that was the name on the deeds, was a man of perhaps 35, tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years at sea. His hair was dark, his eyes a pale grey that reminded her of the winter sea, and a long scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, pulling the skin taut in a way that should have been disfiguring but was merely interesting. He was not handsome, precisely, but he was compelling in a way that made Jane's carefully constructed composure feel suddenly flimsy. "Miss Holloway," he said, and his voice was deep, with a roughness that spoke of disuse. "I am glad you came. The house has been waiting for you." Jane gathered herself, summoning the persona she had decided upon during the long journey from London, the harmless, forgetful spinster, the woman who had no interest in the past because she had no future. "How kind of you to receive me, Captain Gray," she said, allowing a tremulous smile to touch her lips. "I know it must be an imposition, my coming so soon after you have taken possession. I only wish to see the old place one last time before everything changes." His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "An imposition? Not at all. I am eager to learn whatever you can tell me about the house and its history. A new owner, I find, must be a student of the past." It was a statement that could mean anything or nothing. Jane filed it away and allowed herself to be led into the house she had not seen since she was 18 years old. Chapter 2. The house was smaller on the inside too. Jane remembered long corridors and vast rooms, but the manor of her memory had been a child's kingdom, peopled with ghosts and secret passages and the promise of hidden treasure. The reality was a modest country house, well built but unremarkable, its rooms filled with the accumulated debris of generations. Captain Gray had not changed much. The furniture was as she remembered it, the paintings still hung on the walls, her father's books still lined the shelves of the library. Only her father himself was missing, and the absence of him was a presence in itself, a hollow space that echoed with all the things left unsaid. "Your father was a remarkable man," Gray said that first evening, as they sat in the drawing room with a fire between them. His collection of Jacobite memorabilia is quite extensive. I have been cataloguing it for the past week. Jane kept her face carefully blank. My father was interested in many things. He was not always practical in his pursuits. Practicality is overrated. Gray's scar pulled at his mouth as he spoke, creating an expression that might have been a smile or might have been something else entirely. I have spent my life at sea, Miss Holloway. I have learned that the practical course is not always the correct one. Sometimes the impractical, the romantic, even the foolish pursuit can lead to discoveries of great value. She heard the weight beneath his words, the suggestion that he knew more than he was saying. It was a test, she realized. He was testing her to see what she knew, what she suspected, what she would reveal. My father, she said carefully, pursued many foolish things. They led him nowhere but to an early grave. Gray's expression shifted, something flickering in those pale eyes that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction. You did not share his interest in the past. I shared his interest in living, Jane said, and rose to retire for the evening. Good night, Captain Gray. I shall begin packing the library tomorrow, as we discussed. She left him sitting before the fire, and she did not look back, but she felt his eyes on her all the way to the door. Chapter 3. The library was her father's domain, and it was there that Jane began her own search. She came to it each morning after breakfast, claiming she was sorting through the books her brother wished to keep. And each morning Captain Gray found some excuse to be there as well, organising the shelves, consulting a volume, asking questions about the family history that seemed innocent, but were always pointed. You spent much time in this room as a child? He asked on the third day, watching her dust a row of theology texts with exaggerated care. My father believed that a daughter should be educated, Jane replied. He taught me Latin and Greek, history and philosophy. He said that a woman's mind was no smaller than a man's, only differently employed. And did you believe him? I believed that he believed it. She set down her cloth and turned to face him. You are very curious about my father, Captain Gray. May I ask why? He did not look away. I am curious about the man who built this library, who filled it with books on Jacobite history, who spent his final years pursuing a legend that had consumed his family for generations. I am curious about what he found or did not find, and what he left behind. Jane's heart was beating faster, but she kept her voice calm. He left behind debts, and a house he could not maintain, and 2 children who learned that the past is a dangerous place to live. And the treasure? Gray asked. Did he leave that behind as well? The question hung in the air between them. Jane could feel the weight of it, the moment of truth that would determine everything that followed. I do not know what you mean, she said, and watched his face close like a door. They continued their dance for the next 3 days, circling each other through the rooms of the manor, exchanging pleasantries that were not pleasant at all. Jane pretended to be a simple woman who remembered nothing of her father's obsession. Gray pretended to be a simple sailor who had inherited an estate by chance and cared nothing for its history. Neither of them believed the other for a moment. It was on the 5th day in the chapel that the game began to shift. Jane had gone there to escape the rain, seeking the quiet of the small, cold room where her ancestors lay in their marble tombs. She was standing before the monument to her great-grandfather when she heard Gray's footsteps behind her. There is a legend, he said, coming to stand beside her, that the Holloway treasure is hidden in this chapel, that the clues are carved into the stones themselves, waiting for the right eyes to read them. Jane did not look at him. My father believed that. And you? She turned then, and for the first time she let him see something of the truth. I believe that my father wasted his life chasing shadows. I believe that if there was ever a treasure here, it was found long ago, or it never existed at all. I believe that the only thing waiting in this chapel is dust." Gray was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather book, its cover worn and faded. "I found this in the library," he said, "hidden behind a false panel in your father's desk. It appears to be a journal." Jane recognized it instantly. It was her father's prayer book, the one he had carried with him always, its pages filled not with scripture, but with his private notes and observations. "You have read it," she said, and it was not a question. "I have read it." He held it out to her. "Your father believed he was close to finding the treasure when he died. The clues led him to the mausoleum in the old churchyard. He never made it inside." Jane took the book, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Why are you showing me this? If you want the treasure, why share the clues?" Gray met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something beneath his cool exterior, something that looked almost like pain. "Because I am not the only one looking," he said, "and I cannot find it alone." Chapter 4. The mausoleum stood at the far end of the churchyard, a small stone building half hidden by yew trees and choked with ivy. Jane had not been there since her father's funeral, when she had watched his coffin be carried into the family vault, and had vowed never to return. Now she stood before it with Thomas Gray at her side, and the past felt closer than it had in 12 years. "The journal mentions a key," Thomas said, studying the iron door. "Something about a key that is not a key, hidden in a place where prayers are kept." Jane thought of her father's study, of the rows of prayer books on the shelves, of the hours he had spent reading and rereading them as though the answers were hidden in the words themselves. "The pews," she said suddenly, "the family pew in the church. There is a prayer book there, one that has been in the family for generations. My father used to say that it held all the answers, if only he could read them properly." They went to the church together, a strange pair, the scarred captain and the spinster who was not what she seemed, and found the Holloway pew in the corner, its wood dark with age, its cushions worn thin. The prayer book was still there, a thick volume bound in leather, its pages yellowed and fragile. Jane opened it carefully, turning the pages one by one, looking for something that did not belong. It was Thomas who found it, a small key, no larger than her finger, sewn into the binding of the book so cleverly that it had gone unnoticed for generations. "The key that is not a key," Thomas said, holding it up to the light. "It is a skeleton key, the sort that opens old locks, the sort that might open a mausoleum door." They returned to the churchyard as the light was fading, the key clutched in Jane's hand. She had spent her life believing the treasure was a myth, a fairy tale her father had told himself to justify his obsession. But now, with the key cold against her palm and Thomas Gray at her side, she found herself hoping. It was foolish. It was romantic. It was exactly the sort of impractical pursuit she had sworn she would never indulge. She did not care. The key fit the lock of the mausoleum with a click that seemed to echo across the silent churchyard. The iron door swung open on protesting hinges, revealing a darkness that smelled of damp stone and old secrets. "After you," Thomas said, producing a lantern from his coat. Jane stepped inside. Chapter 5. The mausoleum was smaller than she remembered, its walls lined with the tombs of Holloways who had died centuries ago. Their marble faces stared up at the ceiling with blank, unseeing eyes, and Jane felt the weight of all those generations pressing down on her. "The journal says the final clue is in the tomb of the first Holloway," Thomas said, reading from the book. "Sir Edward Holloway, who died in 1712. There is something about his hands." Jane approached the tomb, her lantern casting dancing shadows across the carved stone. Sir Edward lay with his hands folded across his chest, his fingers curled around something that had once been a sword but was now worn smooth by time. "His hands are empty," she said, confused. Thomas came to stand beside her, studying the carving. They are holding something. Or they were. Look, there is a space between his fingers. Something has been removed. Jane leaned closer and saw that he was right. Sir Edward's fingers were curved as though they had once clasped an object, but the object itself was gone. "Someone has been here before us," she said, her heart sinking. "Someone has," Thomas agreed. "But perhaps they did not find what they were looking for." He reached out and touched Sir Edward's stone hands, running his fingers along the worn marble. Jane heard a click, soft as a breath, and the front of the tomb swung open. Behind it was a small alcove, no larger than a bread box, and in the alcove was a leather pouch. Jane's hands were trembling as she reached for it. The leather was brittle, crumbling at her touch, and inside... She tipped the contents into her palm and felt the breath leave her lungs. It was not gold, it was not jewels. It was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small portrait of a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. "What is it?" Thomas asked, his voice strange. Jane held up the portrait and watched his face go white. "That woman," he said, and his voice cracked. "That is my mother." Chapter 6. They sat in the church until dawn, the letters spread out between them, the truth of 3 generations laid bare on the cold stone floor. The woman in the portrait was Margaret Ashworth, a Jacobite sympathiser who had loved Sir Edward Holloway's grandson, William, and had borne him a child. But William had been promised to another, a woman of fortune and family, and Margaret had been sent away with her infant son, Thomas's grandfather, and a promise that the Holloways would always provide for them in secret. The treasure had never been gold. It had been a child, hidden from the world, supported by the Holloway family for 3 generations. The legend of the treasure had been a cover, a story to explain the money that disappeared from the estate each year, a fiction that had grown in the telling until even the family had begun to believe it. "My father spent his life searching for treasure," Jane said, her voice hollow. "He neglected us, neglected the estate, drove himself to an early grave, for a secret he already knew. The letters were in the prayer book. He must have read them. He must have known the truth." Thomas was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough. He did know. The journal, there is an entry near the end. He wrote that he had found the truth, and that it was better than any treasure. He wrote that he was sorry he had not seen it sooner. Jane looked at him, at the scarred face that held echoes of the woman in the portrait, at the man who had come to Holloway Manor with his own secrets and his own pain. "You are the treasure," she said softly. "You are the child the Holloways were sworn to protect. That is why you inherited the estate. Not because you bought it, but because it was always meant to be yours." Thomas shook his head. "I did not know. My mother never told me. She died when I was young, and I was raised by her brother, a man who hated the Holloways for what they had done to her. He told me the estate was mine by right, that the family had stolen what should have been ours. I came here looking for proof, for something to justify the years of bitterness. And instead, you found letters." "And instead I found letters." He looked at her, and his eyes were wet in the lantern light. "I found a family that had kept its promise for 100 years. I found a father who spent his life searching for a treasure that was already in his keeping. I found..." He stopped, swallowed. "I found you." Jane reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around hers like a man reaching for a lifeline. "The treasure was never meant to be gold," she said. "It was meant to be connection, family, the truth of who we are and where we came from. My father understood that in the end. He wrote that it was better than any treasure." "Your father," Thomas said slowly, "wrote that he hoped one day the 2 parts of the family might be reunited, that the child who had been hidden might come home." They sat in silence, the Easter bells beginning to ring in the church above them, the first light of dawn filtering through the mausoleum's dusty windows. "You are home," Jane said. "You have always been home." Thomas raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture so tender that Jane felt her heart crack open. "I came here looking for a legacy," he said. "I did not expect to find forgiveness." "And I came here to pack boxes," Jane replied, laughing despite the tears on her cheeks. "I did not expect to find anything worth keeping." Epilogue. The Easter service was already in progress when they emerged from the churchyard, blinking in the pale morning light. The church doors were open, and Jane could see the villagers gathered inside, their voices rising in the familiar hymns. She should go in. She should sit in the family pew and pretend that nothing had changed, that she was still the spinster aunt come to pack up her childhood home, that the man at her side was nothing more than the new owner of the estate. Instead, she turned to Thomas and said, "The treasure is not gold." "No," he agreed. "It never was. The treasure is this house, this land, the people who have lived here for generations, who have kept their promises even when it was difficult. The treasure is—" She stopped, swallowed. "The treasure is you." Thomas reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I have spent my life at sea," he said. "I have seen storms that could tear a ship to pieces, waves that could swallow a man whole. I have never been afraid. But I am afraid now, Jane. I am afraid to hope that I might be allowed to stay, that I might be allowed to know you, to be part of this place, to be—" He did not finish. Jane kissed him instead, there in the churchyard, with the Easter bells ringing and the morning light spilling over them like a blessing. When they broke apart, she was laughing and crying at once, and he was looking at her as though she were the treasure he had been searching for his whole life. "My father wrote that the truth was better than any treasure," she said. "He was right, but I think he would also say that some treasures are worth searching for." Thomas smiled, and the scar on his face pulled into an expression of such warmth that Jane felt her heart turn over. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I have found what I came for." They walked into the church together, past the astonished villagers, past the rector who paused mid-sermon and took their seats in the Holloway pew. Jane opened the prayer book, the one with the key still sewn into its binding, and found the words for the Easter hymn. Beside her, Thomas began to sing, his rough voice finding the melody with surprising grace, and Jane felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for 12 years. She was home, and the treasure she had found was worth more than gold. Later that day, after the service had ended and the villagers had gone home to their Easter dinners, Jane and Thomas returned to the mausoleum. They replaced the letters and the portrait in the alcove, sealing it behind the stone tomb once more. "This belongs here," Jane said. "The truth belongs to this place. It does not need to be dug up and displayed. It only needs to be remembered." Thomas took her hand. "Then we will remember, together." They stood in the quiet of the mausoleum, surrounded by the marble faces of the Holloways who had kept their promise for 100 years, and Jane thought that her father would have been satisfied. Not because the treasure had been found, but because the truth had been honoured. And when Thomas Gray, the man who was not a Holloway by name but was one in every way that mattered, kissed her again, she thought that some treasures were not hidden at all. They had been waiting all along to be found. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the